You're listening to In the Fast Lane. This is episode number 7 of the official podcast of the Australian Grand Prix. Matt Clayton here in the host chair as we wrap up another doubleheader of motorsport on 2 and 4 wheels last weekend, with round 6 of the Formula 1 season in Barcelona and the 4th race of the MotoGP campaign in Austria. In Spain, it was a 4th win of 2020 for Lewis Hamilton, who extended his World Championship lead for Mercedes, while Red Bull Racing's Max Verstappen and Hamilton's teammate Valtteri Bottas rounded out the podium. The top 3 in the championship in the top 3 positions. Daniel Ricciardo missed out on a points finish by a little less than a second, with 11th place for Renault. And that's where we'll leave the F1 wrap, because there wasn't much else to come out of a typically processional race in Barcelona. But on 2 wheels, what a weekend that was at the Red Bull Ring in Austria. We had a shock development in the rider market. We had 2 of the most frightening accidents you're ever likely to see. Thank goodness everyone's emerged largely unscathed from those. And we had a first podium of the season for Australia's Jack Miller, who finished 3rd for Pramac Ducati. Later on, we're going to be joined by a special guest to talk about the 2020 season as a whole in Australia's 5-time 500cc world champion Mick Doohan. But first, he's emerged from his Spanish F1 siesta and he's on a 2-stop coffee boss strategy for this week's podcast. It's my co-host, Michael Lemonato. Hello, Michael.
Oh, Matt, I'm due a siesta. There's so much motorsport this weekend, and how many weeks has it been, and I don't know what day it is, I don't know what month it is. That siesta's looking good.
It's great to have motorsport to talk about after so long not being able to talk about it, I guess. But look, there is a lot to get through here with what happened in Austria, but let's look at the race results on face value before we sort of really get into the story behind them. We know the Red Bull Ring's a circuit that suits Ducati down to the ground, but Sunday's win for Andrea Dovizioso, it's his 3rd there in the past 5 years. You combine that with the more muted races for Fabio Quartararo and Maverick Viñales, and Dovi's just 11 points off the championship lead now. Marc Marquez still sidelined after that second arm surgery, and he'll miss this coming week as well. Might this be a race that we look back at in a few months' time as the decisive moment in a title fight, perhaps?
It sort of feels like that, doesn't it? And I know, and Matt Burt said in commentary, this was a race that delivered storylines worth a decade, and that's probably an understatement, to be honest. It felt like, not only for the championship, but just for the moment that Dovizioso had to win this race. Of course, I was hoping, Jack Miller would get the job done, but the context of this, for the championship, for this being a circuit that he's typically performed at, won here before, and should have gone well at, and did of course go well at, turning around a bit of bad form as well for the start of the year. Everything just came together to deliver this race. It's going to be interesting to see if he can back it up again next week, of course. But, I thought it was really interesting the way he described strange emotions after winning this race. And of course it was, because he's essentially told his team that he doesn't love him anymore. But by the way, I've won you a race. It's just that MotoGP has a habit of delivering that kind of storyline, the perfect moment for the perfect point in time.
Well, look, it was the perfect track for Ducati after they'd had that absolute nightmare at Brno the week before. But the fight really at the front of this race was Jack Miller clearing off with a very aggressive soft front and soft rear tyre combination with the restarted race. We'll get to why it was restarted in a minute. And once Dovizioso got past on lap 10, it was really his race to lose, and Jack was in a defensive mode, trying to hold off Joan Mir from Suzuki, who's chasing his first MotoGP podium. In the end, Jack did it until the second last corner. Mir managed to get him 2 corners from home, but for Jack, very much a welcome first podium of the season at a circuit where Ducati is strong. It's been an absolute nightmare, this circuit, for Jack in the past. He's only actually finished once there, and he never scored a point before Sunday. So to get 3rd place with that slightly risky strategy, he's up to 7th in the standings. A bit of a case of nothing ventured, nothing gained, but I think on the whole, a good weekend for him, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you can sort of tell, or I wonder if this played into his mindset, the fact this hasn't typically been a happy hunting ground for him, that he made that mistake at the very end of the race because he thought that he had less of an advantage than he did. And perhaps had he been a bit more confident in the result, he wouldn't have made that mistake. He would have finished 2nd. So it was good to finally deliver there. And again, we get this interesting contrast here. I mean, great for Ducati, obviously. Great as well that he's now the de facto leading man at the factory team for next season to take that podium position there as well. And like you said, good to see a bit of a gamble. I mean, the first half of that restarted race, it kind of seemed like it was pointing towards it paying off. You could see, okay, his pace then started to slow quite a bit as he chewed through that tyre, but it really seemed like a good call at that point in time. The race ended up just being slightly too long for him, I suppose. But, I mean, what do you think in terms of him moving to Ducati now? that kind of aggression, is that something that's going to be rewarded there? Because I know we're going to talk about this in a minute, but the relationship, obviously, between riders and factory at Ducati is what's going to be crucial for him.
Agreed. I think Jack's very much playing to the way Jack is. If there's a chance to go out on slick tyres on a slightly sketchy, wet, half dry circuit, he's always the guy to do it. He's the guy who's going to take the gamble. He's made a career on that. I mean, he won a MotoGP race doing exactly that. So that's part of his calling card, I guess. I wasn't surprised that he took a risk with the soft tyres, and you could see that, with that Ducati whole shot device, he was always going to try and blitz the first 5 laps to see just what he could do if he was able to get a lead up to about maybe 2-3 seconds. But I think he also realised that trying to fight Dovizioso in a fight that was on Dovizioso's terms was probably only going to lead to one result. So, you may as well push the boat out and see what you can do with your own strategy. Okay, it didn't work, but managed to get on the podium. Speaking of podium finishes from the last race at Brno, Brad Binder, who won that race, he was an unbelievable 4th on Sunday from 17th on the grid for KTM. But the man finishing behind him in the standings, Michael, Yamaha's Valentino Rossi. Let's just get to the talking point of this race. Lap 9 of the original race, we have a massive accident involving the Ducati of Johann Zarco and the Yamaha of Franco Morbidelli. Morbidelli's bike slammed into the back of Zarco as Zarco braked for the uphill turn 3. Both riders come off. Morbidelli's riderless bike shoots through like a missile through the exit of turn 3 and so very, very nearly hit Valentino Rossi. Take us through it because, we see... You get an idea of how quick these bikes are going when someone's not on one of them, when they crash. Yeah. But, I can't stop watching the onboards of Viñales and Rossi in this situation and just wondering how everyone got out of this unscathed.
There are action films with less precise timing than this crash because it's so... I mean, we're talking not only in fractions of a second, but fractions of a centimetre that this went right, I suppose. It sounds perverse to say that a crash could go right, but really, considering what was at stake once those riders separated from their bikes, this accident in many respects went well because everyone emerged fundamentally unscathed. It's hard to put into words, really. I mean, I had the TV on this morning in the background and it popped onto the news. And even then, only in the corner of my eye, I still winced to see those two bikes. One flew over Viñales just perfectly. The other slipped through. It was Morbidelli's bike, I think, that slipped through the two riders centimetrically perfectly. And I mean, I think the picture that that was very visceral watching the crash and no one could not help but wince or swear as I did as that happened. But for me, almost the more powerful picture was watching Valentino Rossi on his chair in his garage afterwards during the suspension. And a replay must have popped on the television as the camera crossed to him and he was looking at it and you'd think he'd seen a ghost. It was just absolute... I think he was still just processing what he'd been through. I think he said, sort of summing it up, that at first he thought it was just the helicopter flying over. And it was only once the accident happened and he'd moved past it that he realised how close a miss it was. Some terrific pictures as well. Maverick Viñales with his hands on his head as he rode through that crash. I mean, the crash itself was obviously extremely shocking, but the aftermath, Matt, with riders sort of kind of pointing the blame at one another, a little bit of post-race counselling as well between Rossi and Morbidelli. It's still got a little bit to unfold, I suspect, particularly considering we've got the same track this weekend.
Well, interesting. Morbidelli on Italian TV described Zarco in a loose translation here as a half killer. They're pretty cutting words. And look, Zarco, for his point, he said he didn't break offline or in a dangerous way. And Rossi was clearly pretty shaken with what had happened to him, but you also have to remember that Franco Morbidelli is one of his proteges, and to see he's a friend of his and someone he's bringing through the ranks in that sort of situation. As I said before, we're just so lucky that no one was seriously injured from this. What it did do, of course, was red flag the race and restarted it over 20 laps. Two names we haven't mentioned yet, the riders who came into this race first and second in the championship. Fabio Quartararo ran deep into the gravel on lap 6 in the restarted race and dropped to last, recovered back to 8th. It was even worse for Maverick Viñales. Qualified on pole, obviously was right in the thick of that accident before the restart. And then once the race restarted, had a bit of a clutch issue on the Yamaha, finished only 10th. The lucky thing for him was he only dropped 2 points to Quartararo in the standings. But there are a couple of other riders who should have been in that fight at the front. Paul Espargaro over KTM. He was actually leading the first race before the red flag and then crashed in the second race. Took Miguel Oliveira with him. That's the second time this year that Oliveira has been cleaned up by another KTM rider, which is not ideal. And Alex Rins, I thought, was the other one. He was in that front group with Dovizioso, Miller and Mir, but he crashed out moments after he passed Dovizioso for the lead on lap 11. So definitely a race that those two should have figured in at the end. But where this leaves us after 4 races, we've got Fabio Quartararo leading the championship by 11 points from Andrea Dovizioso. Maverick Vinales a further 8 points back. Brad Binder, unbelievable, 4th in the championship for the rookie. And Jack Miller, we said 7th, but he's just 12 points off Vinales in 3rd. So given that we're about the quarter mark of this season right now, he's very much in the mix still, isn't he, Jack?
There's no championship that's unfolded in recent times quite like this one, has it? Because you sort of say it yourself, you think back and you remember, for Jack, for example, you remember some sort of pale results in the last couple of races, and then you think, okay, yeah, it's only 12 points to the title because it's such a topsy-turvy event. And Austria putting the crash to one side, of course, with some fairly unusual results for the title protagonist means this is very much still open and still extremely unpredictable. I mean, like we said earlier, Marc Marquez is not returning for at least another race. And even then, he'll have lost, how many races will that have been by then? 5 or 6 Grand Prix. Yeah, even more. So then that's how that will change the complexion of the race if he gets back on the bike, is on form. It's fewer points for other riders to compete over. So, the first stage of this season, extremely unpredictable, of course, an extremely unusual season. I feel like that goes without saying. But, at this point in the season so far, you're still not really any of the wiser as to how it's going to unfold.
You mentioned earlier the other big story out of the weekend with Andrea Dovizioso announcing that he would not be renewing with Ducati. He's been there since 2013 and has won 14 races for them. We could have this quite bizarre situation where Marquez is effectively out of the picture. Dovizioso could win the championship and then leave. I mean, it doesn't get much stranger than that, does it?
Quite a good exit if he does, isn't it? A very mic drop kind of exit. But I still can't absolutely wrap my head around this. And he said this weekend, he sort of confirmed, he didn't really feel loved by the team. He didn't feel like he was valued at Ducati. And it was kind of the undercurrent of that. It's been an undercurrent for a little while, really, ever since the pay cut incident with Lorenzo joining the team and then leaving the team and all that kind of thing unfolding thereafter. But this is still the guy who has been Marquez's closest challenger. He's the guy who's made Ducati in this sort of more modern time, I suppose, a title contender. He's shown that bike is able to compete for championships. He's obviously won races. And yet the relationship, after only a couple of months ago, it seemed like it was going to be okay. No one really expected this was going to be a renewal of terms. That the relationship has unraveled so badly. And it's not even though, of course, we have to remember here, it's not as though he's been poached or has been seduced by another team. He says there's no plan B. He's got nothing signed at this point. To just leave a team like this speaks to something really painfully awry with that relationship. And that's, from my perspective, you've got to be a little bit concerned for the state of that team, I guess. If you're Jack Miller going there, surely you're a little bit cautious now.
Well, I guess so. You can look at it from the other perspective now, and they are crying out for a leader. And I think, Jack's at that age and stage of his career now that if he is thrust into more of a leadership role, then, perhaps it's the right time for him. But so strange is this decision that, every other seat on the grid is pretty much taken for next year, other than perhaps the second seat at Aprilia, which would be a massive step down for Dovizioso if he was to go there. So definitely watch this space on that story. Looking ahead, MotoGP is back at the same circuit next Sunday for the Styrian Grand Prix, but that's for next week. For now, though, it's time to catch up with this week's special guest. Joining us on this week's episode of In the Fast Lane. After a weekend with so much drama in Austria, it's great to have a chat to Australia's own 5-time 500cc world champion, and of course a racing dad to one of our rising F3 talents on 4 wheels. It's a warm welcome to Mick Doohan. G'day, Mick.
G'day, guys.
Mick, great to talk to you as always. Plenty of talking points out of the Austrian GP on the weekend, but let's just dive straight into the aftermath of that. This enormous accident that nobody can stop talking about between Johann Zarco and Franco Morbidelli. We're so fortunate that this wasn't worse given the ferocity of that crash. As someone like yourself, you've seen plenty of incidents like this firsthand. You've probably been in the middle of a few of them. What did you make of it? And, just how lucky these boys are that we seem to have got away with this relatively unscathed.
Yeah, it was very fortunate for Valentino and for Vinales that the bikes didn't take them out. The consequences would have been fairly dire. I think it was extremely unlucky for both of those boys to come together at the bottom of the hill, actually where they came together. It's probably the fastest part of the circuit, to be honest. So, it's 300 plus probably where they came together. And, unfortunate, the downsides of racing, especially on two wheels, are pretty big. And I guess that was highlighted yesterday, but fortunately everyone walked away.
The footage of the crash itself was, of course, pretty arresting, but I actually think the aftermath, seeing the riders get off their bikes and sitting in their garages visualizing replays as well, was also pretty impactful, I thought. I think Valentino Rossi in particular, catching a replay, I mean, he just looked absolutely shattered at that point. I know he's also very close to Franco as well, so I suppose that was playing on his mind too. As a rider, when you're involved in a crash like this, or seeing a crash like this, I suppose, is it kind of a bit of a shock that impacts you? And how do you put that aside to get back on the bike? Because there were a couple of people saying, and I certainly understood it, not being a rider myself, of course, that, Valentino chose not to get back on the bike after that. I don't know how many people would have judged him for it.
Yeah, look, totally understand what you're saying, but equally, every time those guys put their helmet on and hop onto the bike, they're well experienced. They've seen a lot of adversity throughout their years on the bikes, and well aware that they can actually be part of the accident or, badly injured or worse. So although nobody likes to see it and nobody believes it's ever going to happen to them or would like to think it never happens to them, unfortunately, it's just part and parcel of racing. Every now and then there's a big crash. And Valentino's been around longer than most. He was actually competing when I was competing back in the 90s. So he's also unfortunately been involved with the accident with Simoncelli in Malaysia a number of years ago, which was a fatal outcome for the young rider. And I guess there was probably flashbacks for him of something similar to that, and a different crash altogether, but spectacular for anyone, even for a rider, to see that sort of incident. And for Valentino and also his teammate, for the bikes to pass so closely, it could have gone, had Valentino been a half a metre more forward or the bike come across, it could have actually had fatal consequences for Valentino and his teammates. So, that's not taken lightly, but equally the riders are mentally prepared for all that. And as you see, they get back on the bike and they go again. But, there is a little bit of time to reflect when you're sitting there and just so fortunate as well that there was nobody, including the Valentinos and the likes, that they weren't involved with it. No, they weren't injured, but more to the point that the riders involved really walked away unscathed, other than white faces, as you say.
Valentino afterwards sort of played, I guess, a bit of a grandfatherly figure, as I guess is befitting him in this situation. But he sort of pointed out that, rider aggression is becoming a little bit of a problem from his perspective in any case. You see in Moto3 as well, all sorts of packs diving amongst each other, a lot of that kind of fighting. And, okay, the Moto2 accident certainly wasn't a bout of aggression. It was more just a high side. But it's not uncommon to see some really aggressive moves, I guess, in the premier class of racing now, with, improving in safety tech and that kind of thing. Do you see that becoming a bit of a problem? Does the sport need to reevaluate a bit of a balance between, seeing the aggressive riders that people, of course, love to see, but really managing to keep it safe?
Well, I think you go back to the racetracks, the racetracks are very, in the big picture, reasonably safe and compared to years gone by. So, in fact, statistically, I think the doctors used to say at the most dangerous tracks, you'd see less crashing as well, because, people were aware that, a crash could be a big crash. You'd be crashed because you're hitting walls or whatever else you may hit. I think if the racetracks are safer now, sure, the equipment, the riding equipment, you've got airbags, it doesn't fall apart as much. And generally, you're fairly safe as long as you don't hit anything. I don't think the aggression, I think everyone's always, used at that level of racing anyway, a bit of common sense. There might be the odd elbow here or a little bit of paint swapping, but generally it's pretty good. But Valentino's on the coalface. I'm just watching it like you on television these days, so it's a bit easier for me to comment about that. But that's unfortunately you're not going to take out of some of the guys who perhaps take that riding dangerously into their own hands a little bit more than others would. But Valentino, what is he, 41, 42? Not saying that he's too old to be riding. What I'm saying is he's got a lot of experience. He's seen a lot of bad things happen. He knows what can happen by swapping paint, using elbows too much, and perhaps that's what he's trying more to get across. You don't need to actually be doing that. and a lot of the guys at the front generally are pretty safe and race cleanly. And I guess in a fatherly figure type of way, perhaps he's trying to say that to just cool their jets a little bit and ride with their head rather than with their shoulders.
You mentioned someone there who rides with his head all the time is Andrea Dovizioso after winning that race on Sunday. We know that he's now right on the heels of Fabio Quartararo in the championship lead. We know Marc Marquez is out for at least the next race and he won't be back until probably Misano. Do you think he's now the favourite to go one better than he has these past 3 years, given Mark's out of the picture? He's not necessarily the fastest rider, Andrea, but he seems to me to be the guy least likely to beat himself. Do you think we have to look at him now as the championship favourite?
Look, Dovizioso, again, very experienced. He's certainly due a world title. If not, the Yamaha, though, seems very strong. You're seeing all the Yamahas pretty much dominating. With Mark not there, we don't know what he'd be doing if he was on the Honda. But the majority of the Yamahas seem to be strong week in, week out at the moment. So Austria's always been a good, strong Ducati circuit. So, one race doesn't make a championship. But this might inspire him to keep pushing that. It may also inspire Ducati to want to help support him a little bit longer. A little bit more as well, because who else are they going to get? Okay, they got Jack next year, but surely they like to extract as much information out of Dovi before he leaves. So yes, on paper I think that Dovi's stronger than Vinales for sure on the other Yamaha, but Quartararo is going to be a formidable player. I think he's learned a lot last year from Mark, racing with Mark, but didn't quite have the speed. This year, a couple of wins under his belt, he's growing immensely, I think, mentally, and it's going to be hard for him to be beaten, I think, unless he has some more bad luck like you see in racing. But, Dovizioso is certainly a world champion, all world champion material, and, it'd be nice to see him capture a world title, that's for sure.
The elephant in the room of this season really is Marc Marquez's injury, not back for a couple of rounds yet. That is making a difference. We're having a season of very different complexion, I think, compared to the last couple that we've had. This season, in not just MotoGP, but all sports, there's always this talk about being of an asterisk season because of the events. But in MotoGP specifically, does the absence of Marc Marquez make this championship a bit of an asterisk? And I can't help but think there's a bit of a parallel here with your career, isn't there? Because the 1992 title, you lost by only 4 points after an injury of your own, stories of which still make me wince remembering exactly that injury. But is that a parallel? Is this a bit of an asterisk, do you think?
Look, I think sport is sport, unfortunately. I guess that's why we all watch it, and the emotional highs and lows. We all have our favourites, rightly or wrongly, and we can all say if, buts, and maybes, but, that's not the way sport works. So, you always remember the winners and not what could have been. So, certainly Mark was a championship title favourite. Unfortunately, he injured himself. So it's really now, as you say, opened up the season, and you can't really reflect on whether he was there or not because he's not. And, sure, he would be in there, and sure, he would be fast. We've seen that in the opening race. But it's the same as myself in both 92 and 99. And the 99 season had only just started, and I'd injured myself. And, then the racing was on for what people were saying for second place. Well, I wasn't there, so it was actually first, and the guy who won it was my teammate and won the world title, and that's what it goes down in the record books. And that's the good thing about sport. It moves on so quickly, and people just back the people that are competing at the time. And yes, Mark's going to come back. Did he come back too soon? I guess you may ask me that one, but I think he probably did the right thing. He may have just pushed himself too much off the bike than on the bike, by the sounds of it. But he's going to come back, and he will be strong when he comes back. So that may throw another mix into the championship as well. But depending how many races we get, they can squeeze into this COVID shortened season.
Sticking with Mark as well, and touching on your experience with Honda, I think his absence, other than changing perhaps the complexion of this championship's maybe shown that he's been papering over a bit of the cracks with that bike. Are we seeing the true performance of that team at the moment as opposed to him being able to drag it up the field?
Well, look, yeah, I think you're right as well. It would seem that others are finding it difficult to ride, so and more so than you would expect. But my experience with Honda, and although it's decades ago, I think they've still got that same DNA of what they like. Honda just technologically, they're amazing what they can do with engine performance, and the engine is probably still one of the strongest on the circuit, besides Ducati perhaps, or might even be on a par. Mark probably reminds me a bit probably of Wayne Gardner, as far as if you can put a measure between those two, because Wayne just used to like the bike to go quick, and really that was all he was after. And it seems like Mark might be a bit the same. His feedback may not be what others like, but Mark's capable of riding the bike no matter what they give him. Whereas it seems to have gone off path a little bit since Danny Pedrosa has left the team. And in the past, when I first joined Honda, the bike was pretty difficult to ride. And both Eddie Lawson and myself, who were my teammate that year as well, in '89, had both come from Yamaha and tried to make that bike into a Yamaha, of which slowly sort of started to do that. When I was injured again from '92, it took me half a year to get the bike back on. It took me and the team half a year to get the bike back on track, because the Honda engineers had just gone off on a horsepower development, whereas it had that much horsepower. It made the bike difficult to actually steer, stop, and a whole bunch of other things. And really, you want to get from A to B. Being a B the quickest, it doesn't necessarily win your races, because, the straights are generally only about 8 seconds of a lap time. So it seems like Mark can ride this bike, and he's let the engineers just develop it for him rather than perhaps having some input. But that's only my opinion.
Mick, we touched on Jack Miller earlier. We know he's heading to the factory Ducati outfit next season, even though we now don't know who his teammate's going to be. Jack's in that sort of sweet spot now. He's 25 years old. He's been in the top class for 6 seasons. Do you feel this is the right move at the right time for him? Because everyone's trying to find their Marquez beater. You see it with Suzuki and Yamaha. They've got these young guys coming through. Do you think Jack's ready to take on that leadership role there as Ducati try and really get on terms with what Marquez has done over these past 7 years?
Yeah, look, they are. Ducati's certainly a different mindset, the Italians and the Japanese, that's for sure. They like, Jack's a likeable sort of guy, and the Italians like him for sure. He's in the junior Ducati team with Pramac for the past few years. And as you say, he's getting a little older. He's getting more mature as what he's doing on the bike. And he's certainly fast, no doubt about it. So, the next step to the factory outfit may just stabilise him a little bit better as well, a little bit more discipline perhaps inside the factory outfit. And, it'd be great to see him be consistently, he's almost consistently on the front row these days anyway, or thereabouts. And but consistently convert that to race results and race wins. The thing with Mark at the moment, he's so dominant, but just back to what we were talking about, perhaps also the bike has got a little bit too far away, even that he can't really manhandle it the way he used to, and is making a few too many mistakes. But but they get that back on track, and Mark's still capable of fighting the way he was fighting for wins before. No matter who you are and what bike, it's going to be tough to beat him. So, but do I rate Jack Miller on a Ducati? Absolutely, I do. And I hope for our sake, being Australia, that he can bring it home.
Certainly no debate there. And finally, Mick, from 2 wheels to 4, your son Jack's in the middle of his first FIA Formula 3 season, had his equal best result over the weekend. Certainly signs of progress there. How's he been dealing with this first season in Formula 3? And as for yourself, what kind of dad are you watching him? Are you a classic racing dad? Are you getting fired up at his races?
Well, I think certainly, you have a child competing in any sport. There's passion involved with it and emotions for sure. But equally, I'm involved with motorsport pretty much my whole life. So you've sort of you understand exactly what's going on. So that's sometimes good, sometimes bad as well. So because you can actually see what's going on more so than others. But look, it is a competitive field out there. Thankfully, we've got 4 Australians out of 30 drivers, I should say. I swapped the cars, but 30 drivers. And, we've got a young Australian leading he's actually just running second, but he's won 2 of the races so far this year. But, the top, there's 30 drivers out there, and there's really generally in the top, normally there's a second covering the top 20 in qualifying. It's a very competitive series, and it's great learning ground for young Jack, and hopefully he can move from what he's learned this year into something better next year. So, at the moment he seems to be heading in the right direction anyway.
It certainly is a very, very competitive series, Mick. Look, we'll leave it there. As always, it's been terrific to catch up with you and get your insight after a fairly incident-packed race weekend where we certainly had a lot to talk about. Safe travels, and thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
An absolute pleasure.
That's all for this episode of In the Fast Lane. Thanks for joining us, and a big thanks to this week's guest, Mick Doohan. We'll be back next week to wrap up all of the MotoGP action from Austria, and we'll also be joined by another big name guest. This is one you definitely won't want to miss. Until then, for Michael Laminato, I'm Matt Clayton. Join us next time for another lap in the Fast Lane.